It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first plenary lecture at YLMP 2018, and it's my great honor to introduce Professor Stephanie Schnurr. Professor Stephanie Schnurr is an associate professor at the University of Warwick in Coventry in England, and she's employed in the Center for Applied Linguistics at this university. Her research interests include professional and medical communication. She's particularly interested in the role of communication in leadership performance. Professor Schnurr has researched and published extensively on various aspects of leadership discourse, gender identity construction, also strategic uses of humor, politeness, impoliteness, the role of culture. Also, she published extensively on decision-making and advice-giving in a range of professional and medical contexts. Professor Schnurr is a co-author of several books. Her most recent publication, co-authored with Olga Zeiss, entitled Language and Culture at Work, was published in 2017 by Routledge. And now, as far as I know, Professor Schnurr is working on another book, which is going to appear soon. Professor Schnurr has also been involved in several research projects, such as crisis leadership and global governance, exploring the role of culture and leadership discourse, and also telegenetic counseling in Hong Kong. Professor Schnurr is a member of the convening group of the Global Research Priorities in Global Governance, and an ordinary member of the Global Research Priorities in International Development at the University of Warwick. Today, Professor Schnurr will give us a plenary lecture on the topic of exploring language to explain social phenomena, the case of leadership. Professor Schnurr, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you very much for the kind words, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. It's been quite a while since I've been at postgraduate or PhD conferences, so this is a great opportunity to go back to where I started. So my talk today will be on a topic that I feel quite passionately about and that I've done a lot of research in, which all started back with my PhD, but I'll bear you the details, namely leadership. And so what I want to do in the next 40 or 45 minutes really is to show to you or to illustrate how we can explore the social phenomena of leadership through language, and what in particular linguistic research has to offer for research on leadership more generally. And then I'll end by making a very strong call for researchers from business and organizational sciences to start taking linguists like myself, like yourself, more seriously. I think they're starting, but they need a bit more pushing. Okay, but before we start kind of talking about what linguists have to offer for the study of leadership, I think it'd be quite useful to just establish what exactly we mean when we talk about leadership. Now, the thing with leadership is, and maybe that's one of the things that fascinates me so with it, is that it's very complex, okay? So the answer to the question, what is leadership, is not a straightforward answer at all. And one very famous leadership researcher, Bernard Bassett, a few decades ago now, he once famously said that there are almost as many different definitions of leadership as there are people who have attempted to define the concept. And this is exactly the problem, that every time you open a new book, you start reading a new article, they all say leadership, but they all mean very different things. So we'll first kind of spend a few minutes unpacking what exactly we mean about leadership in this talk. Okay, in an attempt to make sense of this kind of jungle of leadership definitions, another famous leadership researcher, Keith Grant, has kind of tried to group them into four different approaches or four different views. So there's a lot of research that's still going on that views leadership as a person that's regarded as the leader. So this would be researchers looking at individuals that they consider to have particular leadership qualities, like maybe Mahatma Gandhi, Coco Chanel, Martin Luther King, so individuals. Then there's a lot of research, well, also my own research falls under, that view leadership as a process. So we're not so much interested in how individuals do things, but we're more interested in how leadership is achieved, how certain processes and activities are being done. And this will become more clearer in a moment when I show you some examples. Then there's also quite a bit of leadership that looks at leadership or that views leadership as a position, in the sense of looking at people who hold powerful positions, like maybe the dean of a particular faculty, or a representative of the city, or the director of a particular foundation, the CEO. So they would be looking at people in particular positions. The problem with the position and the personal approach to leadership, of course, is if you look at specific kind of pre-designed people or positions, you kind of overlook everything else that's going on, which is why I like the process approach. But I'm going to explain that in a second. And then there's another body of research that looks at leadership, or that understands leadership as a result, so the outcome. But as I said, what I want to do today, and what I've been doing in my most recent research, is talk to you about leadership as a process, as an activity. So look at the processes, the activities through which leadership is done. And kind of within this broader view of viewing leadership as a process, we'll understand leadership as a process of sense-making, okay? So something that people do, and I will argue they do this largely through language, something that people do through language that kind of makes sense for others, or in a way that kind of constructs reality in a way that sense-making takes place, and also that influence is exercised. So if we view leadership kind of in this sense, as I said, as a process, as something through which people make sense of reality, through which they maybe construct reality, through which they get other people to do things, etc., etc., then the role of language really becomes quite central. And then we can probably say that leadership outside language, what would that be? Can leadership even take place outside language? So language really has a very, very crucial role to play in leadership. And as I said, this will be one of the arguments where I think leadership researchers in business and organizational sciences, they need to start looking more closely at the kind of linguistic research that we do. So this crucial role of language in terms of leadership processes is of course very much reflected in a whole set of leadership practices. So here's just a little list. Obviously the list could go on for much longer, but this is just a little list to give you an impression of some of the practices that happen, some of the leadership practices that happen through languages and that people have been researching over the past decade or so. So things like getting things done. How do you get things done? Well, you tell people to do things, or you negotiate with people what needs to be done. Making decisions, again, an activity that essentially evolves around communication. How can decisions be made without communication? Or solving conflicts and disagreements, again something that's essential to the performance of leadership, and where quite clearly language plays a really important role. Equally important but often overlooked, things like creating a positive and productive atmosphere in a team, making sure people feel happy, they feel included, they feel they've got a voice, they can contribute. So all of these leadership practices are essentially accomplished in and through language. And yet, what surprises me what still surprises me, I have to say, I've been researching this for quite a while, is that while pretty much everybody seems to agree that language really plays a very crucial role when it comes to leadership, leadership researchers in organizational sciences and business sciences, they are pretty good at ignoring the kind of linguistic research on leadership that goes on. So once in a while they send me some papers to review for journals, and then you read in the first sentence people saying things like, oh, no research exists that looks at leadership discourse or that looks at leadership and language. And you're like, yeah, of course it does. I can easily quote many, many papers that do exactly this. So I think we as linguists, we need to reach out more explicitly to leadership researchers and other disciplines and really make them aware of the kind of research that we're doing and kind of make them listen to the research that we're doing. And if you come to my workshop tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, you will find out more about communicating your linguistic research to different audiences. Just a little advertisement here at the side. But this is a big problem, that there's very little engagement actually across the disciplines. So they each do their kind of research in their own little silo. So what I want to do in this talk then today is two things really. So one is to illustrate what linguistic research can contribute to leadership studies, and I'll be particularly looking at what we can contribute in terms of the conceptualizations of leadership and also in terms of methodological thinking, research design. Well, how do we need to research leadership? How do we need to design our studies if we really want to capture leadership as it takes place? And then I also hope to show you how exploring leadership through language has the potential to generate new insights and to contribute to a better understanding of what exactly leadership is and how exactly it works. And in doing this, very modestly of course, I'm trying to address one of the calls that another famous leadership researcher, Dennis Torres, you notice they are all male, but that's another issue, that another famous leadership researcher very recently in an editorial of the prestigious Leadership Journal has written, where he complains about the current state of leadership studies and says researchers seem content to ask smaller and smaller questions about fewer and fewer issues of genuine significance, producing statements of the blindingly obvious, the completely irrelevant, or the palpably absurd. Okay, so it seems that, and this is not an outsider, so this one from the inside complaining about the state of leadership research. It really seems that they are very much at a deadlock. They really need some fresh air, and I think we as linguists, we can provide this fresh air. And I think if they just looked more towards our end, that would really help them get out of this dilemma. Okay, so what I want to do then, so obviously this idea of approaching leadership through language is not totally new, and other leadership researchers have done it before. But I think we as linguists, we're in a very good position to focus on how language generates new insights into leadership practices. In particular with regards to questions of how is leadership actually done? And then again, if we kind of conceptualize leadership as a process, we can move away from individuals, okay? But look at the processes, look at the team. And as I've got a few examples I'm going to show you in a minute. So we can look at how it's done, and we can ask, well, who is contributing to it, rather than assuming that it must be the chair of the meeting, it must be the CEO of a company, it must be the dean of the faculty. But actually, it can be a whole lot of other people doing leadership. And so while we're doing this, we can hopefully change some of the old traditional views surrounding leadership. So as I said before, this kind of recognition that language plays a crucial role in leadership is something that's kind of swept over social sciences, kind of with this linguistic or discursive turn that took place over a decade ago. And there's a tradition in leadership studies that's called Discursive Leadership, which since 2007, when Gail Fairhurst published her book on leadership discourse, has really gained momentum. And so more and more people are recognizing, more and more non-linguists are recognizing the benefits of taking a linguistic approach to leadership. So just very, very briefly, before I'm going to show you a few examples, discursive leadership basically acknowledges the central role of discourse or language for leadership. And it's very much interested in understanding how leadership is done, as I said, with a particular focus on discourse. And so people working within this tradition, they very much draw on the tools and methods that are developed by discourse analytic approaches, such as conversation analysis and interactional social linguistics. So discursive leadership focuses on analyzing the specific discursive processes through which leadership is accomplished at the macro level of an interaction, and the overall aim is to gain a better understanding of the everyday practices of talk that constitute leadership and a deeper knowledge of how leaders use language to craft reality. So again, this idea of making sense, crafting reality, constructing meaning, and contributing to sense making. So Jonathan Clifton is another researcher who very much views leadership as a process, as the sense making and constructing reality that I mentioned before. Okay, so what might I want to do then in the remaining time, now that we've talked about all the theory? I want to show you a few examples to just illustrate what can be gained by taking this kind of linguistic approach to leadership, and by exploring language to better understand what leadership is and how it actually works, thereby hopefully showing you the strength of linguistic research. And I think one of the main contributions that linguistic research can make to leadership studies more general lies in us being able to use discourse analytical tools like those provided by CA and interactional social linguistics to provide and to analyze spoken interactions, like I will do in a second, or written interaction. I've got an example of written interaction, and to illustrate how leadership is actually taking place. So leadership practices in situ as they occur. And this is very much different to what a lot of people in leadership studies still do, who mainly rely on reported rather than actual interaction. Okay, so they collect their data by doing interviews with, again, leaders, with people they have identified as being in charge, as being in a leadership position, or they send out hundreds of surveys and then basically count the answers, etc., etc. But none of these approaches really enables us to see how leadership actually takes place. And we all know that if we interview people, this has a lot of problems, because they will tell you what you want to hear, okay? Because most people want to be good interviewees. Okay, but kind of these criticisms aside, so I'm going to show you hopefully how the kind of linguistic research that I and my colleagues do, how this can provide empirical evidence either to support or challenge the theoretical debates that are going on in leadership research at the moment, and that at the moment are largely theoretical. Okay, and I will mainly talk about conceptualizations of leadership and then about methodological challenges. Okay, so in terms of conceptualizations of leadership, some of the debates that are currently taking place in leadership studies occur around questions like, what exactly should we focus on? Okay, should we focus on trying to capture or research leaders, as I said before, individuals, or should we try and capture leadership? Okay, so the processes through which certain things may be accomplished, may be achieved, etc., etc. And another related aspect to this is that there's quite a problematic dichotomy that still a lot of researchers use when they talk about leaders as opposed to followers. So this kind of assumes that those two are distinct entities. But the question is whether that's really the case, and whether it is indeed always the leaders who do leadership, or whether sometimes so-called followers can do leadership. And I'm just before coming here, I've worked on a paper where I'm looking at a team where throughout the meeting I can very nicely show how different people take over and how different people do leadership. Different people say, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is the problem, etc., etc. So it's in very many teams, it's not just one person. Okay, So here comes my first example. And in this example, I just kind of want to look at who is doing leadership. And I want to show you some of the advantages of not focusing on a particular individual. So this is a transcript. I'm sure most of you have seen a transcript. I've spoken to audiences where this wasn't the case. So I will not go through this, I won't read it out, but I will kind of walk you through this slowly. So this is taken from a team meeting that, from some data that I've collected with my colleague Olga Zeitz in Hong Kong, where we've recorded, audio recorded a team of geneticists at a clinic in Hong Kong. Now, this is taken from what they called case conferences. So they discuss one of their patients at a time, and when they're finished, they kind of move on to the next patient. Now, all the participants here are geneticists, but Dr. Lee is the most senior one, is the one who's ultimately responsible for the outcome of the meeting. But what was very interesting when we did interviews with the team, they all said that this is very equal, okay? And so they don't consider Dr. Lee to be the leader in any way, okay? So this is fairly interesting to look at in terms of leadership. So what we have here is an episode of decision making, although it doesn't look like a decision, but I'm going to say a little bit about this later. So decision making is one of these activities that has been associated with leadership. So as I said, so we could approach this question, kind of this data with the traditional question in mind. Okay, so who is doing leadership here? And what we would find if we kind of go through the example bit by bit, we would find that this is very much a conjoint decision making, and that the sense making and this influence process is very much mutual. It's very much a collaborative process. So in the beginning we see Dr. Lee making an evaluated statement about the patient report, which is pretty much factual. You know, there's nothing special in the features, then a very long pause. This is then largely supported by the others, okay? So Dr. May, Dr. Ho, they're like, yeah, you know, they kind of pretty much repeat this initial assessment. However, and then I've cut out a few lines because this was quite long. Then what happens a little bit further down the discussion of this particular patient, Dr. Ho makes a suggestion and actually asks Dr. Lee to do something, which again are behaviors that are indexed for leadership. So this is also kind of moving away a little bit from the initial discussion, from the initial decision. Okay, so the initial decision was, you know, there's nothing special in the feature, everybody seems to agree. But then Dr. Ho's like, well, have you got, or you know, look at this MLPA report. Don't ask me what MLPA stands for, I can probably look up. And then they kind of start discussing this a little bit more, so we can see how Lee picks up Ho's suggestions and instructions, and thereby supports them. He then also outlines future actions by agreeing, yeah, I think we should do another one just to confirm our initial assessment. This then generates more agreement. We have Lee asking one more clarifying question at the end, to which one of the other doctors then provides an answer, and the team moves then on to the next client case. And at that point, the decision has been made. And what's really interesting here is that there's nothing that indicates that the decision has been made. So they don't say something like, okay, or oh, okay, then that's fine, let's move on. They just move on. And so just by moving on, it becomes clear that the decision has been reached. So this is quite interesting again, because it's actually not Dr. Lee having the last word. So often the person who has the last word in a decision, or who decides when a decision has been made, is kind of the one in charge. But this isn't the case here, but instead it's one of his colleagues. So again, we can see that in this meeting, sense making is very much a collaborative process, and everybody kind of contributes. Different people can ask questions, can make suggestions. It's not just one person saying what needs to be done, one person making the decision. But as I said, it's kind of very much collaborative. So what this shows is, I believe, that leadership, or in this case anyway, is very much a shared phenomenon, and that different people can contribute to doing leadership, not just the leader. So questions of who is doing leadership may actually change throughout an interaction. And as I told you about the paper that I'm working at the moment, where I can very nicely trace who's doing what, when, where, and also how people sometimes challenge each other's attempt at doing leadership. And I've got one example from the data I'm working on at the moment, which I'm going to show you in a second. But again, what examples like this, and also the next one and the last one, show is that if we focus on just the person that we kind of pre-looking at the data have identified as the leader, then we would kind of overlook a much, much more complex picture. Examples like this also provide evidence to support claims that this dichotomy between leaders versus followers is really highly problematic. Because again, in this case, who's making the decision? And it's clearly not that the other doctors follow their leader, okay? But as I said, it's very much kind of a conjoined effort. So followers often play a much more active and more critical role in leadership research than is assumed in much of the business and organizational sciences research. Okay, one other example then. Because I think what we've discussed so far, and the idea that, okay, well, if it's not necessarily the designated leader who does the leadership, then the question arises, well, does this mean that everybody can do leadership? Okay, can everybody be a leader, so to say? So I've got an example. I said this is from the data that I'm working on at the moment. This is an IT company where I collected some data many moons ago as part of my PhD research. And this is an interaction that takes place between Neil, who is an external HR manager, and the senior management team of the company. So all the people in the room are very, very senior. Victor is the CEO of the company and one of the co-founders, so he's perhaps the most senior person in the room. But as I said, they've invited Neil, the external HR manager, to come into their company and to solve all their problems. So he really should be leading them through the meeting. And in this particular meeting, his role is to outline his vision. Okay, so where does he see the company going? Where does he think the company needs to change? Where do they need to develop? Which markets should they grow into? Etc. etc. So again, this idea of having a vision and communicating that to other people, very much a leadership activity. And so we would perhaps expect Neil to do that in this particular meeting and in this particular excerpt. And in fact, this is exactly what happens at the beginning. So he outlines his vision, and we could say that thereby he's making a claim for leadership. Okay, so he says, okay, guys, this is what you should be doing. So he's talking about the ways in which he's grouped different staff members into different groups, and how he wants to deal with their different levels of performances. So he's making this claim for leadership, and thereby obviously trying to influence future actions of the company. But what happens is that he very quickly gets interrupted by one of the senior managers, who pretty much makes fun of him. He laughingly says, "Regrettable turnover, ha ha ha, what are you talking about?" Okay? And then Victor, the CEO, as I said, the most senior person in the room, also laughs. So, here he is trying to communicate his vision, outline his vision, but he gets made fun of. So they interrupt him, they make fun of him, and thereby they challenge his leadership claims. So what then happens, perhaps not surprisingly, is that Neil tries to justify himself, but he gets interrupted again. So we can see a few false starts, a few attempts where I mean, but again, the others, they just talk over him. And Victor makes more fun of him by actually imitating his voice and kind of creating this hypothetical scenario. Do we regret this person leaving? No, get rid of them, which generates some more laughter, in which Neil eventually contributes. So this little episode then ends with Victor reinforcing his criticism and skepticism by further challenging Neil's attempts at leadership, by really spelling it out very clearly. It's not very sensitive, is it? And again, this tag question at the end kind of makes it particularly challenging. Okay, so basically he's telling him this is a rubbish idea. Okay, so we can see this is an example to show where somebody's attempts at influencing future actions, or their attempts at doing leadership, we could say, is unsuccessful. So what this means, I think, is that while potentially anybody can make leadership claims, for an act to be considered as leadership, it needs to be legitimized by others. Okay, so you can't just tell others what they need to do. You can't just make a decision. You can't just outline future action. If you don't get the buy-in by the others, and I specifically don't want to call them followers, because as I said, I don't think they are followers. But if you don't get the buy-in from others, then clearly there can't be leadership. So this idea that others' leadership claims can also be contested is quite an important one. And again, by doing the kind of linguistic analysis that I've kind of done very much on the surface in this talk, but in more detail in the paper, we can actually trace the specific processes through which this contestation takes place. So based on examples like this, then, I think we can reconceptualize leadership as a continuous process of discursive construction and negotiation that does not reside within individual persons or positions, so kind of rejecting these initial or this other research, but that is rather co-produced among interlocutors. And as I said, this is an ongoing process. So different people do leadership at different points throughout an interaction, whether it's a meeting or the course of a project, doesn't matter. So if we just look at an individual, we overlook quite a complex picture. Okay, so the second point that I just briefly wanted to talk to you about is some of the methodological issues with regards to researching leadership. And again, where maybe linguistic research can make a difference and can make important contributions to leadership studies. So at the moment there are debates going on in leadership research in terms of what exactly should we study. Should we look at actual practice, so what is really happening, say in terms of a project, how a project develops, or should we look at reported practice? Should we interview people? Should we send out questionnaires? Should we tell them how they perceived a particular project? But you can see both approaches result in essentially different data, and they will very often give you very different insights. Okay, in my latest book with Olga Seitz on language and culture at work, we show how people often overemphasize the influence of culture in interviews, and then when you look at the actual practice, they do something entirely different. And culture is very often not an issue at all. But this is just on the side. So again, if we're interested in people's perception, interviews are fine. But if we're interested in what's actually happening, if we want to capture leadership as it takes place, then interviews just won't do. So again, this means that we as researchers, we need to ask ourselves, well, what's the focus of our research? Are we interested in individuals, in leaders, or do we want to know how leadership works, what leadership is? And then this, of course, has quite important implications on the kinds of data that we want to collect. So kind of taking this forward, I would suggest that it's much more productive to follow a particular project rather than individuals. And to gather data from different angles, ideally, to try and capture the various stages and aspects of the project. So rather than, as I said, rather than assuming that a particular person will be doing leadership because they are in a leadership position, or because maybe of their personal characteristics, it might be more productive to look at how different people may contribute to this throughout the course of a project. And kind of very much related to this, at the moment most research on leadership discourse looks at business meetings. So we know a lot about business meetings, and my two previous examples were also from meetings. I've got one more example that I'm going to show you in a second, which is very different. But there are other sites where leadership takes place, of course, in one-to-one interactions, in emails, in WhatsApp messages. One of my PhD students just passed her Viva a few weeks ago. She looked at WhatsApp messages, leadership in WhatsApp messages, blogs, telephone conversations, anything and everything. Okay, so it's really important that we as researchers try to think of ways of how can we capture this other data. Okay, yes, meetings are easy to record because they are there and we can just put our cameras there, similar to this little thing which I try to ignore. But it's, you know, leadership takes place in other places as well, so we really need to try and capture these other places, I think. So what I'd like to propose then is a new set of questions to ask. So rather than asking who is the leader and how are they doing leadership, which were pretty much the questions of my PhD research not too long ago, but I think if we really want to make new or gain new insights, want to make big contributions to leadership studies, to leadership research, we need to ask another set of questions. We need to think about, okay, well, where is leadership happening? So open it up for the possibilities that it may be not the leaders, but that it may be other people who are doing the leadership. Who is participating in these processes, and maybe who's not, maybe who is silenced, okay? I have examples, not here for you today, but in data that I've collected where the person in charge, the leader, does sometimes actually not participate in a decision making. She just sits there and let the others do decision making. So there's still leadership taking place, but she's quite clearly not the one doing it. How is this discursively accomplished? And then very important, what responses do the various claims at leadership generate? Are they reinforced? Are they supported? Or are they challenged and are they resisted? And when this challenge and resistance takes place, I think this is super interesting to explore in terms of power relations and things that are going on there. So I've got one last example that I want to show you, and this is taken from a WhatsApp interaction. Okay, this is data that I haven't collected. This is taken from a chapter that one of my former students, Bernie Mack, and one of his colleagues have written not too long ago. So this is a WhatsApp interaction that was collected at a small business in Hong Kong. So here we can see, so this is an interaction between C and R. I'm going to tell you a bit more about who they are later. So it's very much, so it starts off with C texting R, asking how did he say, okay? So R has just come back from a meeting with a client, okay? So this company, they want to sell some products to the client. So we can see that right in the kind of the opening text, this is an exercise of sense making, okay? So C is saying, okay, so how did he say? So the English is all as in the original, okay? So how did he say? So, you know, yeah, what happened basically? So he very much initiates this interaction and invites R to report back. And we could say this is an attempt at making sense of the situation. He wants to find out what happens, so thereby he's claiming leadership. And so R actually plays along with this. So he reports back. He seems to be quite frustrated. Okay, so he talks about his business and how the potential client was a bit difficult because they asked for something called CIF, which I did find out means cost insurance fright, so some extra additional costs on the sellers. And then what happens is that C provides some humorous advice, so you should answer and I will not spell this out, but you know, provide some humorous advice and guidance on what R should be doing, again, which is very much associated with leadership. And again, this kind of advice giving could be seen, and this guidance could be seen at attempts at sense making and influencing future actions. A bit further down in the interaction then, C gives some more concrete advice where he says, you know, let's talk to Samuel first, so Samuel is their boss. And then in the end, he does what we call relational work. So he kind of, tries to calm down and again reassures him, don't worry, you're not alone, we're in this together. So what we see here is that in this very brief WhatsApp exchange, there's actually quite a lot of leadership happening. But the interesting thing is that none of these people is actually a leader, okay? But rather they are two colleagues who are on the same hierarchical level. So I hope that this example has shown that the good thing about this new set of questions that I'm proposing is that they focus on the processes rather than individuals, and thereby they enable us to capture leadership practices in situ, so as it takes place. And they also acknowledge that people in non-leadership position may and often do leadership. And I've put another paper here, which I've done with one of my colleagues, Sung-Suk Choi, where we looked at a research team that doesn't have a designated leader. So we looked at a leaderless team, and again, we found a lot of leadership taking place, and different people doing it or contributing to it at different points. So just summarizing then what all this means in terms of the methodological implications that I was talking about earlier. I think we as leadership researchers need to really rethink our research design. So in terms of the focus of the study, I personally think we should be looking at the processes, because as I've repeatedly said, if we look at persons, we just overlook too many of the complexities that I believe are really interesting. What data should we strive for? How can we best capture these processes? As I said, again, move away from individuals and try to capture a project. If you can, get different types of data, which isn't easy, especially for a PhD, but then obviously the better the data, the better the PhD, the easier it will be to get publications in high impact journals, etc., etc. And doing this, I think we, as researchers, we also need to try and capture different interactional contexts and to move beyond traditional white-collar business meetings. So in concluding then, I hope to have shown that this focusing on language really addresses this call that Dennis Torridge and other people have made for a radical rethinking of leadership studies. I honestly believe that we as linguists, we have the tools to provide empirical evidence to test and, as I said, to either support or challenge some of the leadership theories that are out there. And so I think exploring leadership through language has the potential to generate many new insights and contribute to a better understanding of what exactly leadership is and how it works. So just in terms of spelling out some of the contributions, as I said, reconceptualizing leadership in the way in which we've done for this talk provides empirical evidence to capture the everyday work of leadership. And as I said, either supporting or challenging current conceptualizations and theorizations of leadership. And by using linguistic tools and processes from CA, interactional social linguistics, CTA, membership categorization, positioning theory, the list goes on and on and on. But we are actually able to identify and capture the very leadership processes which at the moment I think are fairly elusive. And as I said before, a lot of the papers, or most papers perhaps, even that talk about discursive leadership, they are very theoretical and not really empirical. So in terms of methodological advancements then, we could help rethink research design to capture leadership processes as they take place. So hopefully this talk has shown that by focusing on language in leadership research, this really is a promising step forward and is generating new insights into a complex phenomenon that, in spite of so much research effort, so leadership has been researched for centuries, we still know very little about how it actually works. And I think linguistic approaches really can make a big difference. These are all the references that I have read, and this talk draws some ideas from a paper that I've recently published. And that's it.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. Now we have some time for questions.
I'll manage. It's fine, don't worry. Okay, thank you very much for this. Also, I'm really glad that you mentioned power at some point, because that was my first kind of association. It came with you talking about leadership. So if you could maybe, without like spoiling anything that you're working on and you don't really feel like disclosing to us, but if you were to kind of maybe elaborate a little bit about that, because for me, when you talk about how they make this leadership in the context of just the micro context of the interaction, I feel like these two concepts are somehow become like not interchangeable, but are very closely related. Like leadership means I'm having power somehow, one way or another, over how this conversation kind of pans out. Yeah. So if you could.
Yeah. No, you. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I try to steer away from power when I talk, but because it's another big concept. But you're absolutely right. In a way, leadership and power are so closely interwoven with each other. And again, I think everything that I've said today about leadership also applies to power. So again, rather than approaching, say, an interaction or some data by looking at who has power, namely the dean, the CEO, the director of something or other, kind of looking at how do people do power and how do different people at different stages in a meeting, how do they draw on maybe different types of power? So, I can do power maybe in a particular stage of a meeting or project because I'm the expert. So I can, I think I know everything. I think I know better than everybody else. So my word may have more weight. And then this will also be reflected, obviously, in the way I talk. And so thereby I'm kind of talking my powerful position into being. But as I said, then as the project moves on, then maybe different people will be in charge. So again, this just focus on one person would totally ignore this. But sometimes we have leadership constellations like distributed leadership or shared leadership that acknowledges exactly this. And I think, again, in line with the kind of developments that we see out there in the business world, which kind of tends to move away from very strictly hierarchically organized companies with kind of one person clearly in charge and then this kind of triangle. Organizational hierarchies become flatter and flatter. So again, this kind of approach really plays to this because we can really see how people do power, how they collaborate with each other to maybe convince the CEO who is more powerful on paper and who maybe needs to sign this off, but there may be different strands of power, and this would be, you see, I can't stop. So this would be another talk entirely, but yeah, very, very interesting. Power, super relevant for leadership.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one regarding the last example that you quoted is in this situation in which both people are assumed not to be leaders, but you said that, but still I can infer that we are still looking at leadership as not as a process, but talking about individuals. Because if we assume that they were not leaders at that moment, how can we talk about the process? Or how can we see leadership about the process? That's the first question. I'm just curious about that perception, because although I agree that we can see it as a process, there's still this trend of looking at leadership as just individuals and taking into account position and what you said before. And the second thing is more regarding the methodology in terms of research. Because I would like to know how are you measuring these interventions, because in terms of linguistics we try to measure many things, and I'm working with pragmatics and I'm trying to find ways to measure how can we know how pragmatically accurate is a person in a certain context. So in this process, how are you measuring interventions. I know, I bet that individual differences play a huge role here, and also metalinguistic aspects, intonation plays a role, and all those aspects. So how are you measuring that in your research?
Okay, maybe I start with the second question, because that can be shorter, I think. Because the short answer is I'm not measuring anything. So my research and this whole idea of discursive leadership, this whole tradition, is very much placed within a qualitative paradigm. Okay, so I wouldn't go about measuring intensities or measuring or starting to count amounts or something. But what I'm trying to do, and I didn't have time to do it in this talk in detail, but kind of look at the discursive strategies that people use, for example, to do an intervention or to make a decision. And then we can talk about whether, say, a particular claim for leadership is successful or is unsuccessful, like in the second case where it was challenged, and then we can show how it's been challenged by, maybe disagreement markers, by interruptions. There was a bit of humor. There was laughing at the person making the leadership, and then we can also, and again, I've stopped there in my transcript because I was running out of space, but then we can see how the interaction continues afterwards. Do they come back to that initial suggestion? Do they maybe pick it up later? Or is this kind of thrown overboard and another decision has been made? Okay, so it's not in terms of measuring, but it's very much about identifying the strategies through which leadership is done or through which power is enacted, basically. And this, I think, kind of links to the first question. So what I've tried to do with the last example is to show that there can be leadership taking place, and in fact we have tons of examples where we can trace leadership without a leader being present. So in other words, if we understand leadership as this process of sense-making and influencing, we can see that this takes place and that everybody can potentially do it, and that a lot of people do it in all sorts of situations who are not officially designated leaders. And this is a big shift in perception and in conceptualization. If we kind of accept that, rather than a top-down approach, rather than saying, okay, well, he or she is the leader, so we just need to look at what they're doing, and then we get an idea of what leadership is. We kind of say, okay, well, we got this idea of what leadership is, namely sense-making and influencing, and then we look at how this is penned or played out in an interaction. So it's much more like a bottom-up approach, where we look at, okay, well, where are sense-making processes? Where's maybe power negotiated? Where does power become relevant? And we can look at these processes, and then once we've identified these processes and the strategies that people use in these processes, then the second step would be to look at, well, hang on, let's look at who is involved in these processes. And then, as I said, very often we find that it's not the designated leader, or maybe the designated leader contributes but may not actually be the most crucial voice in the doing of leadership. So it's kind of a shift in thinking. I don't want to say a paradigm shift, although it probably is, but it's quite a big jump in terms of conceptualizing leadership.
Thank you very much. I'm totally with you on the process, since I believe that leadership is, every important decision is always a result of discussion with experts and team. It's undisputable. However, there's one thing that I was missing, namely the aspect of leadership which is called responsibility. I'm afraid responsibility comes with the leader, and it's identifiable. And I suppose it was, to me it was missing, because if you do not identify the responsible agent, then the process as such, right, is not fully understood, right? Because at the end of the process, you must have somebody taking up the responsibility.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good point, and you're absolutely right. And often what we find in decision making, for example, is exactly this: that we have it's very much a collaborative process, and different people contribute. But then it's often again, not in my data, but then in a lot of other research, it's then the leader who has the last word. And this is kind of what I said by legitimizing it. So kind of adding this kind of stamp of approval, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's you know, that person's neck at the line, perhaps. In terms of kind of bringing responsibility in there, that's an interesting point in terms of, I think what you probably mean is that we need to include it somewhere in the conceptualization, which, yeah, that's...
Some kind of consequences of the decision. Not even, as you say, the legitimization, but the consequences.
The consequences.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The consequences of the decision, because they are there, right? We don't have to come, I mean, it doesn't have to be, right? But actually...
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I probably have to think about it, to be honest, because you're absolutely right. There are these repercussions. I'm just kind of thinking in terms of research. I mean, these are the bits that are quite difficult to get. But I mean, yeah. But
although I would really like to stress that it's, to my mind, it's extremely important what you say about this collaborative effort, right? That leaders should be taught. This is the way they should do the process, right?
Yeah.
And on the jocular side, maybe linguists should be leaders. No?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
Oh, I'd be first one to say that. But yeah. I mean, this whole idea with kind of focusing on the results. Or the responsibility is perhaps more in line with the approach that Keith Grint described as leadership as a result, so kind of focusing on the outcomes. And I'm just thinking how kind of what the role of linguistics or what the role of linguists could be in this, because as I said, the approach that I've kind of introduced to you today is very much around how we can help capture the processes of the doing. So I think in terms of capturing the processes of the, so what, now we've done it, kind of the, almost like the aftermath of the leadership, that'd be interesting, so thank you. It's something for me to take away.
I also take a human-centered approach in our research. That's why I'm very amazed when that is that we should, at least for now, ignore the actors. I come from an Asian country, and we speak a language in which the attitude toward a person, especially if the person is a leader, is compact inside the language. So, for example, there was this conversation between Chinese-speaking doctors. Were they Chinese-speaking? Mm-hmm. And I suppose that it was an English transcription. So they were speaking in English or in Chinese?
I think it was in Chinese originally. I need to check. I think it was Cantonese.
Because if it were Chinese, I think they could have used the language to address a leader, to address a senior, and they could have used the language to address a junior or something. Because if we talk about just a message, if we see a message as is, well, there is one layer, but there's another cultural layer, which I suppose, for example, in case of Chinese or Japanese, cannot be ignored, because, well, this is how, well, the actors, how they communicate. And if we just look at the message, we can really see how leadership is executed in one way, but there's always an implication of a culture constraint that is there. And even if, well, in a meeting someone disagrees, well, in Asia, they would really use maybe a little bit strict tone, but they will always use this package that is applied to talking to a leader. And there's always this, how do I say this, I don't know, set of constructions that we use to talk to a teacher, to talk to a senior. And most of the time, it's in the language as is. So we can't get rid of it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. This is very, very interesting comment, and I'll definitely go back to the data to check now. But I think what you said again holds true for, you said, well, when people talk to leaders, so that may well be the case. But I think again this kind of doesn't really take us away from looking at how leadership is is been enacted. But what might be interesting, and this is what I need to go back and talk to my translator about, is whether people then also shift maybe their honorifics or maybe shift their pronouns, or as you say, the whole way in which they package, then maybe talking to another person throughout the meeting. So I guess what I'm a bit unsure about is whether they would package your language, as you've said, kind of based on status and authority, so kind of the pre-given. So, this is Dr. something something, so, we have to address her in a particular way, or this is our CEO, so we have to address him in a particular way. Or whether this is more dynamic and kind of can change throughout an interaction, and that maybe when people acknowledge, okay, well now, whatever, in that particular decision, somebody takes a leadership role, or in fact, does leadership, is that then reflected on this level of language? I think that would be quite interesting to look at. I think you've made a note.
Okay, so I find leadership as a collective process very competitive. But what about situation where the place for negotiation or like discussion over a certain leadership decision, for example, is very limited, and a very good example of it would be the military chain of command, where if you could compare military to a society, disobeying the order from higher ups could be considered as a basis to be excluded from the society. So how will you address that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So two things to say there. I mean, first of all, obviously different situations, they call for different kinds of leadership, and they also call for different leadership constellations. And you're absolutely right. In a military situation or in an emergency, if we think about a hospital, like an A&E in an ambulance setting, where like a patient comes in and it's a matter of life or death, then we don't have the time to start kind of collaborative decision making, or what do you think, or what's your idea, then somebody has to make a decision, and that's it. So different situations call for different kinds of leadership. Nevertheless, I think the approach that we've or that I've tried to show to you today would also work in a military setting, where yes, we know who's kind of higher up the command chain, but we could still look at the processes. So we could still say, look at, okay, well, how do these people do leadership, and how do they, although it would probably be more individuals rather than a group of people, and how do they thereby generate particular responses? Okay, how do they tell their soldiers to whatever, wade through the mud or kill people or whatever they do, and what kind of responses does this generate? But in terms of, as I said, the kind of processes, or the kind of analytical and methodological processes that I've described here today, I think they would hold true in pretty much any kind of context, with all sorts of different leadership constellations. But they are particularly obvious, or we can find particular strong evidence or support for these claims in those situations that are not traditional, so where we don't have a leader, or where the leader is not the one doing the leading, which is why I've included those examples here. But I think they also apply, the processes also apply to other contexts.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. And now let's thank Dr. Schnurr.